Uh, this book is a short tome. It's a collection of 15 stories that cross over 25 to 30 years of coverage at mainly mainstream newspapers in those cities that you mentioned: San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, primarily, and Abilene. And what happened is that at each locale back in the mid to late 70s, when I came to Texas, I began seeing just, it wasn't any great revelation, I began seeing gaps in coverage, that whole communities and stories were just simply not being reported. And for whatever reason, whatever motivation, I dwell a little bit in this book, what might have been my motivation, some form of what I call white liberal anthropologist guilt. The upbringing that I had in New York, where my family, my dad had grown up in Italy, and when in my household growing up, he would talk about the American people as if we weren't, and our sense of assimilation and prejudice that we might have experienced a little bit, not myself as much as my parents, of course. My dad was born in 1909, so you put that in some historic context. And then we did something unique in my household in New York, or my various households. We white flighted repeatedly. My family moved 4 times to move away without, there's no other way of saying it, to move away from the black residents that were moving into our neighborhoods. And again, this is a period of time through the 50s and 60s when there was a lot of conflagration and urgency, dominating the news, and a lot of anxieties in my household. With that kind of backdrop, growing up in New York, I had lived in this rapidly changing neighborhood, a very conflicted neighborhood, and this white flight neighborhood, and a lot of racial tension. I was probably predisposed at a great degree. I know I was predisposed at a deep level to sort of roll with the flow and to endorse our movement away from the black residents that were moving into our neighborhoods. I just was. So I was naive and willing to absorb the things that I think my family and certainly the circles that I grew up in endorsed, as ugly as they were. It just seemed to be the thing to do. I didn't have what I would call a very conscious mind. One day when I was a kid, about the age that my son is now, I've got a 12-year-old kid, I rode my bicycle up to the city library, New York City Library, in the neighborhood I lived in, and discovered a thin paperback volume of poems by Langston Hughes. And it's one of the 3 or 4 times where I could really say this, that some form of a light bulb, it's a very low wattage, but some form of a light bulb went off over my head. It was like reading something that had been so deliberately hidden from me. You know that feeling, as a kid when your parents are hiding something from you, and the circumstances you're in are coalescing to hide things from you. That I wanted to read more because it was secret and it was hidden, I suppose ultimately, as I look back, it changed my worldview. It led to things that would change my worldview. I can't say that I, drove back home in my bicycle or rode home on my bike and everything was changed at that minute at the age of 12 or 13. But it led to a thought process that there was another world that had been deliberately hidden from me, and probably, no doubt, hidden from a lot of folks, and intentionally neglected and harmed and isolated in many ways. And you know that, all of you here know that from your own smarts and your study of history and just your worldview. But that was sort of my little coming of age. So with that kind of backdrop, I wound up in Texas. I moved from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where I'd been going to college and a couple of 3 graduate schools, till they finally booted me out because I hadn't been paying my bills. I was on my 3rd school at Columbia University, and I tried to go to a fourth, and they basically said, no, Moss, you should really pay for the previous three. So I moved to Abilene to take a job at a newspaper, which seemed like a great adventure, and I got off the airplane in Abilene and tried to hail a cab. I was standing there going like this outside the airport, and so an elderly woman came up to me and said, what are you doing? And maybe she thought I was saying hi to her, I don't know, but I said, I'm trying to hail a cab, and she said, you're really not from here, are you? You in Abilene, there are only 2 cab companies. One of them just went out of business, actually, so we're down to 1, and you have to call it on the phone. So put your hand down, and I did, and that was the beginning of my understanding. I guess I was smart enough to know what I didn't know. I didn't know jack shit. Excuse my language. I'm remiss in mentioning something too. Just to give you a little tiny bit about my worldview. My mother told me a few years ago, sort of very wise, a woman who, very Italian and so kind of unfiltered at times, almost operatic, I guess, especially when she was chasing me with a stick. But she told me once, only a few years ago, she said, do you know what the first words were that you had ever heard when you were born? I said, no, of course not. How would I know that? And she said, well, the first 2 words that you ever heard in your life on planet Earth, just your emergence into Earth, were, oh, shit. I said, well, okay, like a good storyteller, please tell me more, Mom. And she said, well, she had 4 sons. I was the last. I was number 5. And so the assumption was that there would be a girl. And she basically suggested to me that your worldview has been shaped by those first 2 words that you had ever heard. And I'm glad members of my family are here because they would back that up. But I think the sense is that I think I came to Texas with this cautionary message from this person here saying, you don't understand where you are. You don't know this state. You just don't get it in that very overt way. And then coming down here with this other sense that everybody might be approaching me, and as they see me, also forming those same 2 words I heard when I was born. Oh shit, here he comes. Those 2 things together, kind of set the table maybe for my. I wanted to not fight back so much, but I wanted to keep drilling down deeper into Texas so that I could begin to learn, and that I could learn to not be wary, I suppose, of how people would react to me, I guess is the point. I bounced around in just really without a plan, going to a number of different newspapers and then working for some magazines along the way, trying to write books on the side. It really wasn't a conscious pattern, but again, it seemed a way to get out of the office, get away from editors who wanted to assign me to things that I didn't want to do. And then at a point when I began to familiarize myself just a tiny bit with some of the history that was either overt or I took the time perhaps to absorb by just hanging around with enough people who really knew better than I did, that I really very aggressively began trying to almost only work on stories about African American Texas. It's the height of illogic. It's not rational. I don't know that it's good. I don't know that I did a good job. I just know what I did, and I tried to leave the office as often as I could to go to parts of the various cities where I lived, where I could just simply talk to people. And I suppose there's this idea of immersion journalism that people kick around, and it's kind of a conflicted notion. You spend as much time as you can immersed in a community, and I think that helped in some ways for me. I was able to trick some editors, cajole them, bribe them. I don't know how. Maybe they just didn't want to see me, into spending weeks and sometimes months on stories. I can honestly tell you, I don't know that I emerged with any clarity at the end of those stories, but I did try in some small way, fumbling way, to hold up a mirror, so somewhat consistent mirror to what I saw. And a couple of people who've read some of these stories over the years said, gee, these things are very melancholy, or they're very bittersweet. And I actually really like that. because it conforms to my notion that, and we're talking about black and white issues, obviously, race, that the real answers that might lie in some of the relationships that I dwell on are actually in the gray zone, that there aren't precise answers. And that's no thunderclap. You all know that as well. And we live in such a polarizing age where people need to have that, those certitudes. And really, I think what I tried to do, stories might seem very unsatisfying to you, perhaps, because at the end, I break a cardinal rule that we, sometimes teach over my journalism department. That there should be no questions at the end of your story. You should answer all questions. And I think at the end of my stories, you're probably befuddled and going, "Well, Jesus, he just raised 40 more questions." But I believe that's a better way to begin the dialogue, because I don't believe in certitudes, and especially as it comes to race. I believe in a couple of three certitudes: that you cannot understand Texas to any degree at all unless you understand the history of race here. It's just not going to happen. Certainly the country. The state was built in the backs of slaves. It's a fiscally driven topic, a culturally driven topic. Every major city, every city in Texas is defined in some way. The way they look are defined by race. The reason highways exist, interstates exist, all of it could be really viewed through the prism of race. I just believe that sincerely. And again, I know a lot of you do too. So aside from this lady kicking my ass at the airport in Abilene, I guess it's so long ago I still remember it. That when I first got to the Dallas Morning News almost 30 years ago, I decided to get out of the office again, get out ahead of the high sheriffs, go wander, take the pulse of the city, disappear. And so what I did was go to South Dallas, which is a predominantly African-American neighborhood, a culturally rich neighborhood, and walk up and down Old Forest Avenue, which some folks, I later learned in the community there, believe was actually named after Nathan Bedford Forrest, who had been presumed by some to be one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. So imagine that, the main artery running through the primary black neighborhood community in Dallas might have been named for decades after the leader of the Ku Klux Klan. By the way, the Ku Klux Klan, many of you know this, had once been headquartered in Dallas. A lot of history. It doesn't go away. I think it really seeps into the soil. And I can get all metaphorical on you. I mean, literally blood seeping into the soils. It doesn't go away. A lot of young African-American men disappeared in the Trinity River, never to be heard from again. And you hear stories. So I walked up and down this street that was beginning its evolution, I think, obviously, gratefully away from the possibility that it might have been named after the leader of the Ku Klux Klan, to being named Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. So what a transformation there. What a story in and of itself. So I'm walking along. I'm a total rube. I've got a big sign on me that says, "Hit me, I don't know what I'm doing." And I'm just bumbling around like I do. And I see a dry cleaners that has the most beautiful sign and most attractive sign that I thought I had seen. And it said Bacchus. And the Bacchus Cleaners. And I thought, man, what goes on in the Bacchus Cleaners? I got to go there. There must be, I hope it's the wine festival day and everyone's in togas. So I'm going to go into the Bacchus Cleaners. Just the name itself is summoned me. What a great idea to name your store Bacchus. It's kind of confident.